Calculation is one of the most important chess skills. If you can calculate, you can see into the future of what's going to happen in the game. But how do you calculate accurately, and what separates a beginner from an intermediate player from a master? I'm going to answer that question by showing you how, as a chess coach, I would take the same puzzle and adjust it for players of different ability levels. And I'll show you the biggest mistake that most players make and the technique that masters use to address it. Okay, let's have a look at this position. It's white to move, and we're going to start out with the hardest level of this puzzle. So this is how I would give it to a player, a master, maybe a 2000 plus player, someone who's already quite strong at chess. And as you go through this video, you can pause the video and try to solve it yourself. In fact, I would recommend that. You'll get a lot more out of it if you do. So the way I would give this to someone who's a very strong player is I would just start with this position. We're starting from the earliest point, which makes it harder because you have to see farther, and not give any hints other than it's white to move, find the best move, find the best course of action. So if you want to try the hard version, you can give it a shot here. Okay, well, the best first move for white turns out to be h4. Now, to understand this, we're going to have to see what happens in the future. But just to show why the problems with a few other options, g takes f4 looks like a reasonable move, but black could simply trade queens and be fine. Or this actually allows an even worse move. Knight takes f3 check, utilizing this pin, and this is actually going to be winning for black. For example, king h1 trades, and black could take your rook or your bishop, actually, in either case, with a good position for black. So taking the pawn immediately is not a good idea. Another thing you could try is, looks like there's a very appealing tactic of trading everything on e5, and then g takes f4 check, checking the king, and a discovered attack. Or a discovered attack on the king, also attacking the queen. This looks great, but hopefully you spotted queen g7. Diagonal backward retreat. That's a blind spot for a lot of people. But this saves the queen and answers the check. It forces a queen trade blacks up in exchange. This is also not great. And this is why calculation is so important. If you've gone down this path, your opponent plays queen g7 on the board, it's too late to do anything. You've got a losing position. So you want to see these things coming before they're on the board. Now, the purpose of h4 is to essentially throw black's queen off balance. At the moment, there are two defenders versus two attackers. So black needs to keep that knight defended with everything that they've got. And the queen doesn't have that many squares. There's only f5 or h5 to stay defending the knight. If you go to f6, that doesn't really help because white would just take, and now if you want to capture, you have to give up your queen. So when you're calculating this, you should consider both, but for the sake of simplicity and to keep this video going, let's just look at queen f5, because this is now how I would adjust the problem. Now for a player who's maybe 1800, 1700, maybe I would start with this position and say white move and win from here. So give this a shot. Okay, and an important concept to consider here is the idea of candidate moves, or I might also just call them options. What moves are we considering? So we always want to look at forcing moves, captures, checks, moves that create direct threats. So I would look at g takes f4, certainly either of these captures on e5, and maybe you also consider the somewhat trickier move g4, trying to chase the queen away. All of these moves are promising, and, well, for instance, g takes f4 looks pretty good because if black takes, now we have bishop takes, and because of this pin, white is winning. Black can't take with the bishop, and if they take with the queen, simply take with the rook. But black does have a good defense. Knight g6, blocking the g file, and you can trade if you want, but this knight is doing a good job of blocking that g file, and there's nothing especially great for white here. So to even take it one more level, if I was giving it to a player who wasn't quite as strong, I'd use the same position, but frame it in a different way. I would say, which is stronger, bishop takes e5 or rook takes e5? So it's the same position, but notice that I'm actually making it a lot easier by narrowing down your options and framing the problem, kind of giving you a hint that there's probably a big difference between one of these two captures and one of them works. Because the challenge of calculation is really how to structure your thoughts. So by framing it in this way, I'm giving you a big head start. So let's look at this. Bishop takes probably would be the first move you would consider because rook takes is a sacrifice. We don't want to give away material if we don't have to. So bishop takes, takes. Now again, there's this same, what looks like an appealing tactic, but once again, queen g7. I think we already looked at that one. And similarly, if g takes f4 check, bishop g7 saves the day for black. So what about rook takes e5? Bishop takes, g takes f4 check. Well, now we see the key difference. Bishop g7 doesn't save black because the bishop's still on the diagonal. That's mate. So black has to move their king or block with the queen. Either way, we'll end up with two bishops versus a rook, which is going to be a winning advantage. For example, king h8, bishop takes e5 check, f6. There's actually one more move that you should really spot here, because white has two bishops for the rook and black's king is under attack, but this bishop is attacked and rook g8 pinning our queen is threatened. So there's one more accurate move here, which is bishop d3, hitting the queen. And if the queen moves, it's going to be checkmate. But if rook g8, well, after a bunch of captures, white will emerge up a piece. Bishop takes, rook takes g2, check takes. And white is currently up two bishops. Black can only take one of those. The other will survive. White will be up a bishop. So this is the way to win the position. Rook takes e5. There's one more option, though, g4. And this also looks quite attractive because we're chasing the queen away from protecting this knight. But this one is a little bit trickier than it appears because black can play knight takes f3 check, queen takes f3, queen takes c5 check. And here's one more bonus puzzle. This is often the case in chess, by the way, that if you really go deep, there's a lot of secrets hidden in almost any position. And the puzzle here is, where should you move your king? So think about that one for a moment. All right, the way I would think about this is I would start by looking at what seems to be the most natural move, see what happens, and if necessary, adjust. So to me, I would think king h1 looks like the safest square, hide my king in the corner, my queen's on that diagonal. But then after bishop takes c3, queen takes c3, black can try b5, utilizing the pin to try to get our piece back. Now, maybe you saw further that we can play rook e5, hitting the queen, the pawn, and also preparing rook g5 check. But then black has a key check, queen c6. And after we get out of check, for example, king g1, bishop, pawn takes c4, there's not a clear win for white. We've got a check here, but there's no direct mate. This king can run out to e7, and the position's still highly unclear. So understanding that, we could use the technique of improving on that line. So, okay, we know that our king needs to avoid the checks, and it turns out the best square is f1. h2 also not as good because after the bishop trade, this queen has a different check on f2. But if king f1, in this same line, rook e5, and we're going to be able to capture on b5. Black has no checks, so this does end up winning for white. But I would say the main solution, going back here, rook e5 is the simpler option, because after pawn takes, g takes f4 check, the lines are a lot simpler. So what differentiates the master from the intermediate or the novice level player? Well, a strongman, maybe a grandmaster would see almost everything we've covered in this video from this position at the start. Maybe not everything, but enough to make the correct decision to find a winning path. Now that's difficult. Of course, that's something you have to work up to. But what is the key technique to improve? Well, the biggest difference I've noticed giving a position like this to players of different levels is how you approach the choice of moves. The most common mistake for players at the beginning or intermediate level is they latch onto the first move they see and just go down that path without considering any other options. This is a little bit like if you come to a fork in the road and there's a different path, you just sprint down one path without even looking around. But maybe if you paused and look around, maybe down that path there's hungry wolves, down the other path there's a candy store. So if you just paused and looked, you could make a much better choice. And chess is the same way. Before you shoot down one path, just pause, consider your options. It could be the case that one works very easily, and then you don't have to waste a lot of time trying to calculate down a path that is in fact not that promising. So remember, next time you are in a complex position, pause, slow down, consider your options, and only then dive into analyzing each in more detail.